Okay, how's it going, everybody? Today we're going to talk about the Delaware helmet, or sometimes actually referred to as the Delaware miter cap. This is one of my favorite stories. On December 9th, 1775, Congress raised the Delaware Continental Regiment to fight in the American Revolutionary War. It is said that the regiment wore this leather miter helmet. The helmet has appeared in artwork, books, on statues, on reenactors, and in other places as a distinguishing feature of the Delaware Continental uniform. So here you can see it on the artwork. There's a statue, of course, with the helmet. There's a cup. Soldier has the helmet on. Oh, there's a reenactor. I don't know who that is. And it just goes on and on. I could show you so many examples of this. But the question is, did the regiment really wear this helmet? Did the helmet really exist? Is it possible that the entire helmet is a modern reconstruction that has worked its way into historical fact? In the early 1960s, a helmet that was apparently supposed to be an original leather helmet of the Delaware Continental Regiment was offered to the Delaware State Museum. The state archivist, Leon Vallinger Jr., examined the helmet and found some issues with it. First, he noticed that the helmet was actually made of a fabricoid, which is a synthetic material that was not invented till the early 20th century. Mr. Vallinger also noticed that there was a stamp inside that was from an early 20th century Philadelphia manufacturer. Based on this, the museum rejected the helmet, saying that it was not unoriginal. But the question is, where did this helmet come from? Was it based on an original that is no longer in existence? To date, no original helmets have been found. This would lead credence to the idea that someone in the early 20th century simply made this helmet and that they made up a story that it was worn by the Delaware Continental Regiment. But let's dig a bit deeper to see if that statement is true. About 30 years earlier, in the 1930s, Stanley Arthurs painted artwork that showed the Delaware Continentals on the Dover Green. You can clearly see them wearing these helmets. Also, when Charles Lefferts and McGregor painted the regiment, they included them wearing these helmets. Here you can see Charles Lefferts clearly with the helmet, and McGregor with the helmet as well. But where did this design come from? It is likely that it came from the helmet that was later proven to be fake. Some may say that the drawings are based off an original example, but since no example has been found, we simply can't assume that. We can't assume that something is true based on what might have happened. We need proof that it actually did happen. There's also been some question of the design that appears on the helmet. Could it have even been something logical to put on the helmet? Some say yes, and some say no. But there is at least some anecdotal proof that if there were a design on a Delaware leather helmet, this would not have been what it would have been. But whether the design could have existed on the helmet or not is not necessarily relevant if we cannot find proof that the helmet existed to begin with. Since we have no original examples of the helmet, we must look at period accounts of the uniforms that the Delaware Continentals wore. Were these helmets even mentioned? Our first account comes from a deserter's description from January 21st, 1777. In it, they describe a Private John Alexander who was part of Captain Samuel Smith's 7th Company. According to the description, Private Smith was wearing an old felt hat, deep blue coat with metal buttons marked DB, and a pair of old buckskin breeches. Private Alexander was wearing his uniform from 1776, so this would prove that at least this private did not have a leather cap. This deserter description seems to support a statement made by the Delaware Council of Safety that resolved on 13 January 1776. For those willing to enlist in said battalion, which would be the Delaware Battalion, they shall be allowed a felt hat. There is no mention of any leather helmets. However, this alone does not prove that this leather helmet didn't exist. It only proves that at least some of the men of the 1776 Delaware Regiment wore felt hats. The next account of the Delaware uniform comes from Charles Pope on March 16, 1779. When sending in a request for hats, Lieutenant Colonel Pope writes, "As to the non-commissioned officers and soldiers of our regiment,
They will likewise stand in need of hats by the 1st of May. Pray if it in your power to keep up our uniform in that article by having them bound with yellow, the only distinction now in our cloths by which we are known from the rest of the army. This letter proves that the Delaware Continental Regiment in the later war, and perhaps earlier, certainly wore yellow-trimmed hats, similar to the one you see here. Next, we look to the well-known story that came about during the Battle of Long Island. As the story goes, during the Battle of Long Island, the Hessian troops mistook the Delaware Continentals as Hessians because of the mitre cap the Delaware Regiment wore. As you can see, in the fog, the caps could clearly resemble each other. This looks a heck of a lot like a Delaware cap. However, did this story really happen? What is the original source of the story? Well, it actually comes from an account written by Lieutenant William Popham. This was written at least 60 years after the war when the soldier was 92 years old. This makes the account somewhat suspect to begin with, especially since the lieutenant was confused about other details of the battle. But the account is as follows. 18 men, supposing us to be Hessians by the similarity of our dress, approached near before they discovered their mistake. My company attacked and took them prisoners. Nowhere in that account does it say anything about any helmets or anything. In fact, the author of the book Delaware Continental by Christopher Ward seems to think that what this soldier is referring to is the similarity of their clothes. Some Hessians also wore blue-faced redcoats. However, it can't be established either way what this private was specifically talking about some 60 years after the event. And since there is no specific mention of the leather helmets, the story that the Hessians mistook the Delaware Continentals as Hessians because of the leather helmet must be viewed as apocryphal. But just when you might think that there is no proof of these helmets ever existing in 1776 and beyond, there is one small bit of information that could potentially support it. In a Delaware Continental return, there is a small mention that the men would have had a felt hat or leather cap. This leather cap that is mentioned is of unknown design and dimensions, and it is unclear how many, if any, of the troops actually wore it. It's also possible it could have been a light infantry hat. The bottom line, could this 20th century leather helmet mentioned in fact have been a reproduction of an original? Sure, there is a possibility. However, the chances remain high that this helmet simply did not exist, with the caveat that some of the men may have wore a leather cap of unknown design during some part of 1777. Until any type of legitimate proof comes forward that this helmet existed, we must say that it didn't, and many of the depictions that we see today are simply based on a helmet that someone made randomly at the beginning of the 20th century, and this helmet has managed to work its way into historical fact. Thank you.